This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Joey Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solarpunk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
So, my name is Luka. I go by they, them pronouns. I am a podcaster. I work in media and
your podcast is called Solarpunk Now.
Sorry, yeah. My podcast is Solarpunk Now. It's, philosophy, politics, theory, art, sort of this intersection of art, science, and politics that's all about practical ideas for realizing a better future, not just a reformist future, but actually a radically progressive future. And my research before I started the podcast was a lot on neoliberalism and specifically looking at neoliberal subjectivity. So like what it is to be a subject of neoliberalism, what sort of mental formations that creates, how we think about ourselves and others, how we think about our behaviors in the world, and how a big part of that is like how economics manifests in everyday life. It's sort of made this transition from the academic research world to like how we think of our everyday behaviors. And so that's a really critical, I guess it's a really critical way that we can feel trapped in capitalism or neoliberalism. And I think it's really important to understanding our current predicament and how we get out of it. And so Solarpunk for me, it's kind of an experiment. I'm trying it on for size, but so far it seems to be a really good like antidote to a lot of the ways that I see us being trapped in our current status quo.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see how the conversation goes. I might change the title, but for now, like I think it's gonna be something along the lines of solarpunk and neoliberal selfhood or subjectivities, maybe something along those lines. We'll see. That's a good place to start. I think just talk to us about, like, for those who don't know anything you just said, what does that actually mean? What do you mean by like how we think of ourselves under neoliberalism essentially, and kind of explain that a bit if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, for sure. How far should I go back? Should I define neoliberalism?
Go for it. Do that. I mean, it's so difficult, but go for it.
Yeah, I mean, so everybody has their own like pet definition of neoliberalism, and that's I think it's cool and fun and funny, but also maybe part of the problem and why messaging doesn't get through sometimes. People love to hate on the term and say like, oh, neoliberalism just means whatever you don't like.
Yeah.
But no, that's not how I see it. I see it as a specific philosophy or intellectual tradition. There are distinct thinkers you can point to in the history of economic thinking, and they have gotten together and done these conferences. I don't want to make it sound like a total conspiracy or something, but it is a philosophy that there are books about that you can read, and it's been really influential on policy, especially after World War II and the fall of the Soviet Union. It's kind of become like the new paradigm for political economic policymaking, and it's got this really I guess personal dimension to it. We've sort of internalized a lot of it. So
one example no, it's fine. Yeah. Like one example that I usually think of is we have this tendency. Most folks listening probably can identify with this. Like even when you're on a break, like even when you're not quote unquote working, like legally, this is like your work hours, or you have to, if someone goes to an office or whatever. A lot of folks are these days unable to pause their brains. Like we're always thinking in productive terms, like, oh, I could do this in the next 2 hours, or I should be doing something now, even though this something is sometimes not even defined, at least in my case.
Mm.
That's one of the ways that there was this book. I forgot the name. The guy has a like super Dutch family name. I forgot the name, but it's like the self under. Okay, ignore. Folks can Google something self identity and market identity. Jesus Christ, this is useless. Sorry, ignore me, listeners.
Oh my God. This sounds
but-
familiar. I might see if it's in my reading list. Hang on.
Yeah, I think first name is Paul. That's as useful as I'm getting here. But essentially, like when I read it, it was one of those books recommended by Georges Monbiot at some point. It was like in 2016 when I read it. And it also went into this, like this idea that even when we're not doing what we are quote unquote required to do, for most folks who like have, let's say, a job or a regular job or what have you, especially if it's like a 9 to 5 thing or whatever, we still have something in us. Is not like the separation between work and personal life, let's say, is not as rigid anymore in that sense.
Totally. Yeah. I did not find the name of the book, but we can move on. So, I had this moment, must have been a couple weeks ago. I was falling asleep and I was thinking, okay, I've got a few minutes now before I fall asleep. What can I do with my brain that would be like productive, that would set me up for my day tomorrow? It's like that level of every minute in your 24-hour day, even when you're sleeping, it has to be optimized, it has to be productive, you have to be investing in your human capital. And that comes from the enterprise model of the self, or the enterprise model of human being. And that was something that Foucault introduced. This great series of lectures called The Birth of Biopolitics. And that's just a really great introduction, both to the intellectual history of neoliberalism that I was talking about, but also this enterprise model that he sort of outlines a framework for. So under classical economics, which would be like classical liberalism, the understanding of human beings is as like rational economic actors in a market. And what is relevant for classical economics is our behaviors in the aggregate. So supply and demand, these sort of like trends that once enough people are behaving in a market situation, making choices, you can say, okay, the demand is at this level or whatever. But with neoclassical economics, it gets this sort of update where market analysis is then extended to the individual, and the individual becomes something that can be analyzed with these economic tools. So what you see is a transformation from us just as actors making choices to enterprises. Like we are, each of us, our own company competing against other companies, and that metaphor maybe isn't the full picture, but it's a pretty good place to start for understanding why we feel like we always have to be productive. It's because we're a collection of assets, and productivity is one of our assets. So if we're not constantly working on improving that, or happiness is another one, we have to be happy so that we can be more productive. We're not competing effectively if we're not constantly working on investing in that human capital.
One of the kind of like the fault lines for me, in some sense, when I think of like my own past, it's I used to be, and I still am to some extent, but it's been kind of diminished, let's put it that way, or weakened. But I used to be really into languages and language learning, quite literally just for the fun of it. Like I grew up in Lebanon, and there was no point learning Japanese. Like it did not further my career in any way, shape, or form. But I did it. I don't speak much of it, but I learned a bit, like basics and stuff, just because it was fun. There was really no other purpose. And that time spent on it, which is like I never calculated, obviously, because that was part of it. But days and weeks and months or whatnot. It's much more difficult to do now, obviously, because I'm at a different age, I have different responsibilities, blah, blah, blah. But also because I've internalized a lot of the past decade, and this idea of having to maximize, personal branding and that sort of thing. I've done my best to both at the same time I have to sort of play that game on the internet to some extent, while at the same time constantly having to fight against it and push back and not let it define me. So I literally go through like ups and downs basically. At times like I need to take a step back. I almost quit social media like 10 times maybe in the past decade, different things. But as it happens, I'm still kind of in that world. I'm trying to balance needing to be in that world for like financial reasons or whatever, while at the same time having this like life that doesn't entirely depend on it and whatnot. And the balance is pretty difficult. And even that, even being able to strike some kind of balance, as I said, a pretty weak one that doesn't necessarily last too long often. And I go through phases, as I said, like a few months where I'm just reading about how I need to relax and take control of my own time and blah blah blah. And then other months where I'm like completely into it and stuck glued to my phone and what have you. But even that is in some sense a privilege these days, which is saying a lot, not a lot of good things. But it says a lot because most folks actually don't have even that time, or at least the resources needed to, or yeah, I mean, I think folks know what I'm talking about, like the time to sit down with yourself and not have to survive economically or whatever. But we're not necessarily talking about that, right? Like we're not talking about, and I hope it's obvious to listeners, but like I'm also not blaming anyone for not doing better. Actually, that's the entire point, is that doing better and always needing to optimize the self and whatnot is literally part of the problem. But it's so difficult that even the language of, because it's like the analogy I have sometimes is like when we think of growth in the sense of like economic growth, the term growth sounds positive, right? And it's easy to confuse that with like obsessing over GDP and that sort of thing, when the actual indicators for like a happy life or a stable life usually don't have much to do with that. Actually, sometimes it stops. And there are episodes on this. Folks can go back to I forgot the name of the title. One of them was with Julia Steinberger, I remember. So folks can there's like 2 or 3 episodes with her. One of them would be the obvious one. So that's one of those things. So when you say stuff like degrowth, right, it sounds like, well, we're having stuff, more things, and now we're gonna stop having those things, and that's not a good thing. Because even in the language of degrowth, for example, we like I'm part of that movement. We have to sort of use a language, like kind of literally borrow the language from growth, essentially economic growth at the very least, in order to make the case for degrowth, because it's become so hegemonic. And even when it comes to I want to be able to take proper breaks. I want to enjoy naps. I want to sleep, whatnot. I find myself looking up the tools to do so, in the same way as I would like optimize my note taking and my productivity and my whatnot. Like it's gotten so hegemonic that even it's almost like I forgot that this is literally something one can do like naturally with one's body and whatnot. But that's where we're at.
Yeah, it's a trip being a like a leftist thinker who's still like very much participating in these things that I'm criticizing. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm so aware of like, oh my god, the fact that I'm beating myself up right now for not being productive, that kind of thing is what I am trying to fight against, or like point out how peculiar and arbitrary that is. But it's still there in my brain. It's still like so foundational to how I think about my life and what I'm doing. Um, there's a German philosopher, Byung-Chul Han,
Mm-hmm.
who talks about this sort of internalization of power. And his book is called Psychopolitics. He's got a couple books, but that's probably the one I would recommend starting with. And Psychopolitics is sort of a reformulation or an extension of Foucault's concept of biopolitics. Um, and it's where neoliberal power has, I think the way he summarizes it, or like the subtitle of the book, is like how neoliberal power has discovered the mind or the psyche as a field of domination or a
Mm-hmm.
field of productivity. Um, so, our psyches are, in a sense, complicit in this structure of power. We reinforce it in like our negative self-talk to ourselves. It's it's not just that something that I think is really critical about this, it's not just that we internalize it or believe it. It's not just, we accept our subjugation or whatever. We enforce it on ourselves. We become the manager of the employees. So like if you think of the mind or the self as a capitalist firm, we are both our manager and our employees. We're managing ourselves, we're disciplining and punishing ourselves. And our behaviors on social media, they start out as, it's exciting. It's exciting to connect with your friends, share about your life. There's a lot, like when I first got a computer or a phone and started exploring what was out there, it was really fun, and I didn't even realize the ways that by participating in that I was sort of aligning my desire, my enjoyment with power. So under this new system, there's maybe like this classical model that people have of like a factory, of like the place where labor happens, and there's like this boss that's like disciplining his employees really harshly and like, you better get back to work, and they all resent him. um, but what happens now is desire is actually cultivated, and it's cultivated in these ways where we think we're just enjoying ourselves and maximizing our self-pleasure, but actually the ways that we do that are complicit in power. We're participating in mass surveillance, like willingly, pleasurably.
Mm-hmm.
And pleasure becomes an asset for us to maximize because it makes us happier and more productive. And as long as we're consuming something in our self-care, as long as our self-care is financially benefiting someone, it's not a waste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other side of that, and I mean, one of the yeah, I mean, it's multifaceted, obviously, right? And one of them is, for example, myself as a writer, one of the things that kind of freaked me out at one point is when I realized that I was actually catering a lot of not just my writing, but my thoughts on how they might look like in a Twitter thread. Like quite literally, this started like I started picturing it in those terms. And the thing is that it's a normal thing to do. In the same way, when you're writing, let's say pre-social media on your laptop, you start picturing your text on the screen on the laptop, right? And before that, the typewriter or whatever. So like the mind is doing something that's very normal for it, like for us, right? It's just that the difference this time, if we're talking specifically about like surveillance capitalism, which is an element of neoliberal capitalism, at least a more recent one, more recent manifestation. I get fuzzy on like the specific differences at some point, but I know that like if you want to chronologically, like neoliberalism really peaked, or at least started dominating in the 80s, and since then has continued. And surveillance capitalism obviously is more recent in that sense. Let's say decade and a half, maybe 2 decades or so. The difference is that between like let's say the laptop in and of itself and the laptop, or let's say me as a writer on the laptop and me as a writer on Twitter or whatever, is that Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, are not neutral places, right? Like they're actually talking back to you, so to speak. They're surveying you quite literally. This is how the algorithm works. I think many folks kind of understand the gist of things, although the details for most folks are kind of very difficult for me as well, like to grasp, because for one, usually the algorithm isn't open anyway. You don't know how much data they have on you. You don't actually know how much it works. But okay, let's digress a bit from surveillance capitalism, because that's obviously one of those aspects. In the first episode of this year, of 2023, I'm talking as if we're already in January, but it's gonna come out in January for most folks, except for Patreon supporters. Head out to patreon.com/FridayStars. So, the first episode is going to be with Andre. The first episode of the year is going to be with Andre, who you've had him on your podcast. So he has the it's called Hydroponic Trash is the Twitter and TikTok handle, and we talked about Mark Fisher's last, or at least the title comes from Mark Fisher's last series of lectures on post-capitalist desire. And the link, obviously, it's kind of a theme a bit in the first few episodes of January. Obviously, it's intentional. But talk to us a bit, like your understanding within what you were talking about, like the self and neoliberalism, all of that. How do you understand capitalist realism for folks who don't know what that is?
So capitalist realism is a term that was coined by Mark Fisher. in his book by the same name.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of other people have talked about it. There are a lot of other terms that are kind of close to it. But the core of it is sort of this, I guess I would say, naturalization or normalization of capitalism as the only way or the best way that things can be done. It shows up after the fall of the Soviet Union when, here was this very, very prominent example of not capitalism that you couldn't ignore. And then we saw that it failed. It was like, well, okay, I guess there is no alternative to capitalism. So that's the Margaret Thatcher quote, right? Is that there is no alternative. Um, so it's got this very pessimistic dimension to it because it's not so much divine. It's not so much defined through positivity as negativity. It's like, well, we can't do any of these other things, so we're stuck with capitalism. And the best thing you can do is accept it, make the best of it, be the most productive self as enterprise that you can, try to get ahead, be responsible for yourself and your family. Um, but yeah, it's this very like pessimistic, kind of cynical view of the world. I hear it so much. I hear so many people say, like, I don't like capitalism, but I don't know what else there could be. It seems like the best thing we've got. Or you might hear someone say, well, capitalism and communism are both bad, but therefore I'm just going to stick with the status quo. So it doesn't require you to like positively buy in to the theories of capitalism. You don't have to like think that it's correct, that it's the best way, so much as you have to just accept it.
Yeah, well,
Um,
you have to believe that there
and
is no alternative. Quite like it is. Yeah, so I didn't mean to interrupt, but like it is like the other side of obviously Margaret Thatcher's thing is that she would also say, she said once like there's no such thing as society, right? Like that's because it's the natural outcome in many ways. If there is no alternative to this economic phenomena, whether a political economic phenomena that's all about individuals, but also individualization in the sense that things we're no longer a community, we're no longer a society, we don't belong to something else other than maybe ourselves, and for conservatives, at best maybe your family, although the family ends up being kind of an extension of the self in this very patriarchal way. Then it kind of it's a logical conclusion of that logic, right? Like of that philosophy, yeah.
totally, that's something that's really interesting to me about neoliberal theory or philosophy. It's again, it's this normalization. When so so when you say that there is no such thing as society, it's all individuals. Some theorists took that took that very seriously, and there's this whole neoliberal project that is investigating and explaining the world and explaining society by breaking down the concept of society and trying to explain everything in terms of individual behavior, in terms of self-interest. You get theorists like Gary Becker, in his like acceptance of the Nobel Prize in economics. He talks about how altruism can be explained as a selfish individualist behavior. It's really interesting. He's like, well, parents might be seen as selfless for like raising their kids, doing everything for their kids, but they're actually just investing in their kids so that their kids will be productive in the future and then provide back for the parents. Like it's a return on investment sort of thing. So the the realm of the social and the moral and the political gets totally collapsed down into individual economic behaviors and the aggregate of those behaviors. And so capitalist realism has this like, I guess, scientific, economic dimension to it, or I guess I should say scientistic, not scientific, right? It's this sort of like valorization of science, um, without the sort of critical reflection of, well, are these economic theories really the best way to understand people? We just sort of take it for granted that, yeah, okay, there are markets and individuals. That is all there is. So we might as well just do the best we can within that rather than actually considering what other theories could be used to understand the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the term capitalist realism is so useful because it allows you to understand that when one says, that, let's put it this way. Often when you can imagine the scenario as, I think lots of folks would have had it. I've certainly had it. Where like I talk about alternatives to capitalism and whatnot. The person on like the opposite side of that debate, like imagine I'm kind of a straw man figure here, whatever, but isn't they don't necessarily disagree with my intentions, maybe, or they don't say that, yeah, maybe, whatnot. But you gotta be realistic about things. Like they position themselves as the realists, quite literally the realists, and you're the idealists, and that binary obviously is I think part of the problem. But let's take it as such. The realists, quote unquote, in this framework believe in this thing called Homo economicus, i.e., like again, this pre-neoliberalism, even classical liberalism, as you mentioned, like the irrational person, that person was imagined as a man, not coincidentally, obviously, irrational person who is able to rationally think about X, Y, and Z, and through the magic of the invisible hand of the market, supply and demand. So obviously you want this, or X amount of people want this, therefore there's going to be some kind of supply to meet that demand. Now, I think many folks by now understand that that's not quite as simple as that. And I think more recently, especially with social media, it's become a bit more easy to understand, I think, that the desire, because part of the assumption of the rational person is that the desire that you have is your own. Okay, maybe advertisers can nudge you in a certain direction, but this is still your own decision, right? Like that's part of the myth, that's part of the idea. And because we think in this, or at least I think the part of it is a bit of a natural, I don't know, natural, but in understandable. Let's put it this way: we don't want to believe that we're this easily influenceable, right? Like we're still. This advertising doesn't affect me that much, right? Or if I do buy it after watching it, it's actually because I really wanted to do so. We don't want to believe that we're that malleable as selves, as individuals and whatnot. And I'm not saying that this isn't a conspiracy. This is not rocket science. This isn't like, or actually those very smart people behind closed doors are just making you believe that you want to buy this Adidas whatever. It's not like that. It's more that the I trapped myself now because I said it's not that, and now I have to say what it is. Shit. But I mean, part of what it is this idea that we live in a certain world and that this world has very specific rules and regulations and a certain logic to it. And you may not like it, but if you don't like it, well, you're being an idealist. You're just not being realistic. You're not participating in the world. You're not doing your part, etc., etc. And that you can take this to different conclusions when you start from sort of this assumption. And what I find interesting in like your project, I think what I'm trying to do as well, what so many folks these days, which is very interesting and very nice, and I hope more of them start popping up, thinking about these actual alternatives and not just in a, again, using that binary before in this quote unquote idealistic way, but quite literally thinking like very concretely, how can we have this better model, this better society, this better what have you, in this prefigurative way, which is one of the unofficial themes of 2023 on this podcast, like prefigurative politics, acting or like having a politics today based on this ideal, right? Based on this thing. So talk to us a bit about that, because I know you're kind of thinking along the same line. Like we had this chat we had like a Gmail chat before recording. And where do you see the sort of the link between that impulse and Solarpunk, right? With the title of Solarpunk now, the title of your podcast.
Sure, yeah. I also just wanted to mention real quick, you know, how you you were saying you were trapped in a corner of like, well, it's not that there are people behind closed doors just manipulating you. Um, you're totally right. There is never just that direct link of like we're being mindlessly controlled. We're all sheep. Like that's only part of the truth. But there is a history of a very concerted effort of psychological science influencing PR firms and advertising and industries like the happiness industry, psychiatry, even. We don't need to get too much into that. That's complicated. But that's more my personal beef. But, there are industries out there whose goal is to manipulate consumers, because there is this understanding of the consumer as so we the focus is on the choice at the margin. So that's the moment you're at the store, you're deciding, should I buy this brand of juice? Should I buy this brand of juice? Should I buy no juice? That's, you have a choice to make. Which one will improve your utility? Which one? In that moment, you're imagined by economists as like kind of a passive input and output system. It's very behaviorist, very physicalist. It's not about your free will in that moment. So debating about whether we have free will in those situations is a whole other story, but there are industries and fields of research that understand you and try to operate on you as such. So I just wanted to make a note of that. The advertising industry is very powerful, has gotten a lot of resources over the years. It's also only like 100 years old, or a couple hundred, depending upon where you want to put the start date. We lived most of our lives as a species, as humanity, with nothing like the advertising industry that we have today, and we take it for granted as like central to our experience. But um
Before you
so
continue on
yeah.
you had a tangent, so I can have one too.
Okay, yes.
No, I'm joking. But there are campaigns around the world. I know there's one here in Geneva where I live, of having a no advertising outside policy, like those billboards and that sort of thing. And I find it very interesting for the reasons that we're talking about now, that it's not like more popular than it is, right? Like I think eventually, once they kind of get enough votes, enough momentum, enough what have you, probably it will happen. It has already happened in some cities. I'm spacing out on some names, but I know that it does exist in some cities around the world. But it's interesting that most of us have grown so used to them, of seeing this ads. Growing up, I remember seeing like Marlboro ads in Lebanon before those were kind of phased out for obvious reasons. But we're sort of very used to it. It's almost like, if this doesn't happen, how am I going to find out where to do this X, Y, and Z, or where to buy this product, or where to subscribe to this, what have you. And I think it's, I won't go too much into it, but I think it's interesting to wonder, kind of like as a thinking exercises to listeners, like, why is it difficult to even picture getting out of your house, walking to, or taking the bus or driving or whatever, towards work, or towards, I don't know, dropping off your kids, or whatever you do on a daily basis, whatever that activity looks like, and not being able to not picture those billboards. Because I think that's a very interesting thought experiment. I've tried to do it, and I genuinely have difficulties picturing the neighborhood I live in without those billboards. But yeah, sorry.
Totally. No, I think that's actually a great segue into Solarpunk. What I like about Solarpunk is it asks a lot of questions like that. Like, why not just imagine a world that does have X or doesn't have Y? Why do we take all these things that are very very just not arbitrary, but like they're historical artifacts. We happen to live in a world with advertising, but it's perfectly reasonable to imagine a world that didn't have advertising, because for a very, very long time we did not have advertising. And what would it look like to make a conscious return or transition to a world that either doesn't have it or has a lot more limits on it? Solarpunk is a speculative tradition or genre. It seems like a very direct confrontation to capitalist realism, because pretty much every Solarpunk story challenges something that we take for granted. I like to imagine capitalist realism as sort of like this like a dome. Like, maybe think of like a snow globe. We're all living inside this snow globe that's got this artificial ceiling. We can't see out past it, or at least it obscures our vision a lot. But that dome is constructed. It's constructed by neoliberal ideology and all of these pressures that we face from like the PR industry and advertising. And it's so important that we have tools that challenge that artificially limited horizon, that break through the glass, punch a hole in it, realize there's something way more beautiful on the other side, or at least that the outside is way bigger than we've ever thought about. We just assume that the horizon of possibility is so much narrower than it really is. I've been reading a lot of work by this anthropologist David Graeber. I've mentioned him on the podcast. I quoted him in like the first 3 episodes or something like that. Graeber co-wrote this book with David Wengrow, an anthropologist. No, sorry. Wengrow is an archaeologist. Graeber was an anthropologist. And they go through, and it's a really, really bold and lofty goals in mind. It's this really bold project to basically reimagine human history. We have this very narrow understanding of human history that's sort of this like determinist progression from like a little primitive tribe to like villages, and then we start farming wheat, and then cities appear, and then states show up, and it's like this very like straightforward progression. But they go back and actually look at the archaeological evidence and actually look at how societies today have drastically different ways of organizing themselves. And they say like all of these narratives, they're kind of just BS. Like this is not, there's no scientific evidence backing up this direct progression, or this claim that like without um nation states as we understand them, we just descend into this like this chaos and lawlessness. He spends a lot of time talking about the work of Thomas Hobbes, and his sort of like war of all against all, and how that was totally just a thought experiment and not actually supposed to be any sort of theory about how we used to behave. Um, anyway, it's a great book if you're interested in this sort of Solarpunk mission of blowing up these ideas that we take for granted, showing how arbitrary they actually are, um, looking at how many different trends there are in society and culture, and how we could just choose to work on different trends of like cooperation and ecological harmony, rather than accepting that competitiveness and selfishness are the only aspects of human nature that we can draw on.
Mm-hmm. So just today, as it happened, I was listening to a podcast on, I think the BBC, on Kropotkin, like his life and whatever. And one aspect that I didn't know, I knew he was like, I don't know what his actual, I think he was a geographer, like he was a scientist of some sort. And he obviously wrote the book on mutual aid. I think he was one of the first to use that specific term. And he was, I think the title of the book is something along the lines of like mutual aid, a factor in evolution, right? That was a conscious reply in some sense. Like he wanted to be in conversation with at the time the dominant Darwinist, especially social Darwinist, which is different than like Darwin himself, but whatever, the distinction doesn't really matter here, which had that imaginary, which I think still exists to a large extent today, of, what's his name? Thomas Huxley, who was kind of dubbed Darwin's bulldog, because he was the one who was like very aggressively pushing for that. And again, there's a nuance here between evolution as it is understood in biology and then social Darwinism as it is understood politically, economically, etc. Those are two different things, and people tend to confuse the two. But Huxley's entire thing is that life and the natural world, which he then extrapolated from this belief into the human world, was, I forgot the sentence, something like nasty, brutish, and short, something along those lines. And so, as it happened, Kropotkin was in London at the time when this was kind of, he was in exile, obviously, from then Imperial Russia, Tsarist Russia, and he wanted to talk about that and respond to that. And there was he sent a lot of correspondences to Huxley, but that, as far as we know, were never answered. And so the reason why I bring this up is that this idea of Kropotkin, and he's not the only one, to be very clear, like he just wrote a book about it at the time, but this idea that actually mutual aid, like quite literally helping each other, cooperating, communicating, even not just within the same species, but through different species, this is something that not that long ago, and it's still very much an ongoing thing. We're discovering that, for example, trees actually communicate with one another through those very weird, like mushroom rhizomic connections and networks that I'm barely understanding all of this. Like I'm really slowly getting into it. But all these interesting, people I think can just look it up these days. There's a book I think called The Interesting Life of Trees or something along those lines that gets into all of this. And what's very obviously interesting is that if we think of a lot of like indigenous politics, indigenous knowledge, this kind of is taken for granted. And so one of my kind of light bulb moments, if you want, is that if there was this entire worldview, and I don't want to romanticize it too much, like there are issues in any society, and so on, but it is a very distinctive thing that in the sort of rational man, again, this is a very gender thing, in the Cartesian sense, and especially after social Darwinism, which then kind of, again, all of this ended up complementing whether it's post-World War II capitalism, whether it's neoliberalism especially. And I think again, I don't want to. I'm simplifying just for and I also confuse myself, like just for the purpose of this conversation, obviously. But it is something. There's something to be said that today we think of Homo economicus, of the myth of the rational man, the market, whatever, as maybe not nice, not fun, maybe not even the best, but the only, as we said, right, like the only thing that is realistic, quote unquote. And if we think of these different structures, like if we're being scientific, if we're applying the method of science and being realistic, not quote unquote realistic, but actually realistic, like being rational, let's put it that way, then we have to take in all sorts of data. We have to take in all sorts of information from all sorts of different, maybe communities, maybe even the natural world. Like we just need to be objective. Again, I'm using all of this kind of in quotation. And so we have to also take into account the communities, and human and non-human, that actually do cooperate. And what are they doing that works? Maybe they're doing some things that don't work. Like let's take in all of that data, let's take in all of that information. And I think there's something to be said, and this is obviously the part of what we're talking about, that we don't take as much that sort of data, because in some sense it's inconvenient. Like if you really are learning about how trees communicate and how there is this rhizomic, which I'm probably pronouncing wrongly, doesn't matter, but this network between them and how they're literally communicating and exchanging carbon, and the fungi kind of take like 2% of some of that, and man, it's so complicated. Again, I'm barely understanding all of this. I probably butchered it, but that's kind of the gist of some of it. And then you take this as part, if you internalize this in some sense as like this is actually also realistic, well, then you start understanding, I think, that what you have been referring to as realism, as, I'm just being realistic here, is actually a very specific type of belief. And that's what Mark Fisher was talking about, obviously, as capitalist realism. So I hope any of what I just said made sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Okay, good.
the fact that when you have a theory that human nature is inherently competitive, which I would say that's the dominant theory of human nature, at least in this Western neoliberal sort of cultural zone that I've only lived in the U.S. I've never been outside of it. So when you have this theory that human nature is competitive, any evidence to the contrary, any evidence of humans cooperating, is the exception to the norm. That's data that doesn't fit in the model, and we've kept I'm really interested in like the philosophy of science, how these theories are formed and how they change and how they're challenged. And we've been at a point for the last several decades, I guess, where this theory of humans as Homo economicus, as acting in self-interest, we keep trying to modify that theory and like fix it and tidy it up and add new features. Like it's got its mind, it's got its psychology now. We've just kind of like added things onto it,
and even
making
and
this
even
theory
even try and change the world to fit that theory. Like just if
right,
the theory
yeah,
doesn't work, we need to fix absolutely everything else to make sure that the theory works.
absolutely. Like everything else at the expense of preserving the theory, when we could also very easily have a theory of human nature as inherently cooperative, or that cooperation and competition are both these evolutionary trends. So like you said, Kropotkin's work in this area is like super important. This like foundational investigation into like like challenging the assumption that evolution is just a matter of competition. Like cooperation, mutual aid are also a central part of it. And Murray Bookchin's work in social ecology expands on that. A foundational aspect of Bookchin's naturalism is that there are trends in our evolutionary history or natural history that are cooperative, that are about mutual aid and freedom and making free choices. Um, and I think it is high time we have what like philosophers of science would call a paradigm shift. We need to look at some new theories and see if there's one that better fits the data instead of continuing to just like Frankenstein on this like very long dead zombified Homo economicus.
Yeah. I live in the city where Frankenstein was written, which is the only claim to fame of the city, I think, other than the UN is here. But anyway, no, I obviously completely agree. And funny segue, but like speaking of Frankenstein, the idea of imaginaries, right? Like this is gonna be a theme that's gonna be even like I'm gonna repeat it a number of times and kind of explore different aspects of it throughout 2023 and probably beyond it. But I'm focusing on this year for now. Again, we're not in 2023, but this is the magic of podcasting. One of the things that I found super interesting, and you know, I've been kind of hampering on this point now for a few months, if not a year or so, is that it is super easy for us to imagine the end of the world. Like in terms of literally just making that mental effort. And that's because for the most part, we're not thinking of anything original. Like we're borrowing or we're taking in stuff we have seen or some we've heard about, usually in the form of movies, maybe some series, maybe, you know, some books, or maybe in the way of just talking about certain things. This is something that is normal. I mean, none of this is normal is such a contentious term. I don't know what other term to use. Normalized, maybe. Let's put it that way. It's normalized to think of the end of the world. You know, again, that often used quote of like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, you know, etc., etc. And I think what the work that we should be doing is making it harder to imagine the end of the world than let's just making it easier to imagine the end of capitalism. Quite simply that. Because the end of the world means the end of capitalism. That's kind of the weird thing about this lack of imagining is that we kind of think that, well, we can continue doing capitalism even if capitalism is leading us towards the end of the world. And so there is a mental trap there. There's something quite literally in how we're thinking. And again, for listeners, I think folks know this by now. Whenever we explore one aspect of something in depth, we will leave out certain other things. I think that's just the nature of a conversation. So I'm not saying, oh, like listener who is, I don't know, on your way to work now or whatever, like just open up your mind. Like fuck that. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying it's part of the problem. It's part of the tools. If we want to imagine different structure, we need to quite literally be able to imagine. Kind of, it's a repetitive thing, and that is an action, like, or that is a skill, right? That is a muscle in some sense. That in the same way as I said that it's very easy to imagine the end of the world. But maybe it shouldn't be that easy, but it is easy because that muscle has been just like developed, you know, and saturated at this point, right? It's just such an easy thing to do. But why is it difficult to imagine? If I'm picturing an episode of Star Trek, and I talk about Star Trek a bit, the 4th episode of this month, actually, again, January 2023, will be with Jesse Gender, who has this YouTube channel on science fiction, LGBT issues, autism, and other stuff. But specifically, we spoke about Futurisms. And it's going to come out after this episode, if I have my timeline correct. And one of the things I like about Star Trek or other sci-fi, like futuristic stuff, is I picture that world that they're portraying. Because usually, if it's like good sci-fi, it's operating on a certain logic, right? It's saying that there is a timeline, this happened, in the kind of the universe of Star Trek, the 21st century, so our current century was kind of an ugly one, but then after that, there was like World War III and whatever, and then after that, kind of humanity got its shit together, there's no money, there are replicators that just create food out of, you know, whatever the specifics are. But even in that world, they have, you know, adventures and things happen and they meet some species or like stuff happens, human things happen and non-human things as well, because in that world there are like aliens and whatnot. but it's not fantastical in the sense that it's sort of within the logic of the universe. It's rooted in something that is quote unquote logical. And so if we can imagine something like that, we imagine a world, they go on this planet or this happens or whatever. What I find interesting is, as a kind of, again, training that muscle, so to speak, exercising that imagine it, all of that, is picturing myself in that, or picturing society in general, or the world as we know it as that, and taking that for granted. Like, this is the new realism. This is what, in that world, this is what it means to be quote unquote realistic. What are even the boundaries within that logic? And it's an exercise in imagination. It won't necessarily change your day to day necessarily, but it allows me, in any case, to see the daily life that I'm going through and the logics of the society and societies in which I live, because I've moved through many countries now, through that lens of, well, they're operating under a certain logic. That logic needs to be questioned. I'm kind of simplifying, obviously, and it allows me to have that, because you're escaping into a world, and then you're coming back to your world, so to speak, and then you are able to question your world slightly better, at least if you're kind of doing. You can also just watch it because it's fun, but if you're kind of doing that exercise. And so that's what I find very interesting about, and this is slight awkward segue, but I want to talk a bit about hauntology and hauntings and so on. But I'll let you kind of respond, think through what I just said, or what if you wanted to share something, because I'm kind of hogging up the space here.
No, that was all really great. I don't have much to add. I mean, that's what I like so much about Solarpunk. As a speculative genre, it looks at things that are happening now and extends them into the future. But there's no reason that the only future that we can write about is more ecological destruction, more capitalism, more advertising. Like, we don't have to just imagine this kind of like cyberpunk future, even if that might be kind of like in cultural vogue right now. But Solarpunk says, well, actually, there's all these communities who are getting together and like working on permaculture and reappropriating private spaces for public use. All these things are happening in our world, even if we don't have as many conversations or stories about them. And that's why I think it's really great that we have a genre that's explicitly writing stories about those things, or
Exactly.
Artistically describing those things.
Yeah, I just hope, I have a feeling it will happen, if hopefully I'm not just being naive, but I have a feeling that cyberpunk is reaching a sort of a certain saturation, let's put it that way. I personally got a bit bored of cyberpunk aesthetics, and part of it was fun growing up. I did enjoy watching some film, but just the aesthetics of it and the underlying logic that I forgot. I think it was William Gibson, but I might get the name wrong, who said like cyberpunk is high tech and low life, essentially. And obviously with Solarpunk, and I've mentioned this a few times already, but with Solarpunk, it's high life, so to speak. And tech, it's a question mark, in the sense that tech can be high tech, can be low tech, can be no tech, depending on what the context requires, right? The point is that there are human needs and there are also non-human needs, and in order to meet them, we may use technology, or we can use technology, and technology can facilitate that, but it's repurposed to be in the service of that, essentially. And so the kind of awkward segue in talking about hauntings and hauntology and all of that is that it's sort of the flip side of talking about imaginaries, because I'll kind of give a bit of background for if someone hasn't listened, because I think I talked about it in the first episode, the one with Andre, a bit, but if they haven't listened, I'll quickly say it again. So hauntology sort of started, or at least was popularized by Derrida. In French, it sounds the same thing to talk about ontology, and hauntology, it sounds the same thing, it's a pun. And the idea is that he was sort of responding to the famous Declaration of the End of History by Fukuyama in like 91 or 92, whenever he published it, and Derrida published his thing in 93 or something. And he was like, so Fukuyama said that at the end of history, i.e. the Soviet Union collapse, i.e. communism, quote unquote, or whatever the Soviet model of that was, failed. And, I think I would obviously agree with that. The Soviet Union was a kind of a disaster. But that failed. That wasn't good. That wasn't a good model. Therefore, the reason why the West triumph, again, using the terminology of Fukuyama, is that they have a superior model, right? Like this whole liberalism meets capitalism, all of that. And Derrida was sort of saying that in declaring that Marxism the dead, because again, in that context of the early 90s, you've actually created a ghost. You've created a specter. And his book was called Spectres of Marx. And because now communism is this thing that haunts, again, I'm using Derrida, I'm not saying this is what I agree, but this communism haunts capitalism, essentially. Okay, that's sort of some of the background. What Mark Fisher, I think, did very interestingly is he wasn't just talking about these hauntings from the past, right? The past, the Soviet past or whatever, but hauntings from the future, i.e. the hauntings of the future that never came to pass. And communism is one of them. In the context of Lebanon, one of the chapters of my PhD actually is on, I'm not going to get too much into it, but essentially these visions of the future that a lot of folks had in the 60s and especially in the 70s that never came to pass, but that the people that had them, most of them still exist today. They still live today. So what is their present like? Because their present, it doesn't look like the future that they sort of imagined, right? And this can be communism, it can be pan-Arabism in the case of Lebanon, it can be like other isms, pan-Islamism to a certain extent with some folks and so on. And that did not come to pass, obviously. It doesn't exist in the way they pictured it. And so where is that? Where is that future? Where does it exist? And the idea is that it's a haunting. Now, haunting, it's easy to imagine it as a literal ghost because it just makes it easier to talk about it and think through it. And I think it's nice to have these mnemonic aids anyway. But obviously, it's more like it's a philosophical concept, and it's one which I do think has an impact on quote unquote the real world, i.e., like it does actually affect how we go about our lives, because if we think of them as ghosts and whatnot, it can help explain why it's so difficult to imagine alternatives, because those are the only alternatives that we think could have existed, and they're dead. They're haunting us, they're ghosts, they're specters and phantoms and whatever. And we don't want that, obviously, because they're dead and therefore they've lost and so on. And so we stick with our current model, our current system. And so the point isn't to say that bring back those ghosts and let's do a bit of state Soviet communism or a bit of pan-Islam, whatever. That's not the point, obviously. They've collapsed, they failed, whatever. The point isn't to just go to the past. The point is to ask, well, if they failed, doesn't that also mean somehow that the thing that we are currently living in can also fail, might also fail? Because a lot of the bureaucrats of the Soviet Union never quite imagined that this amazing thing that lasted almost a century and whatever would actually collapse the way it did, but it did. And that certainty, that realism, being realistic in the Soviet sense, did not save the Soviet Union. So what tells us today, given that we know the limits of capitalism and we know the damages that it's having, we literally know the impacts that it's having on the earth, which has finite resources and whatnot, why are we so convinced, or at least, let's put it differently, why is it so difficult to put a stop to that? Okay, I'm not talking at the structural reasons, because there are those. I'm talking even like in a mental way, like quite literally thinking of these alternatives. Okay, this was a much longer introduction than I thought it would be. But talk to us about ghosts. At least how you think about them.
There are so many directions I want to go here. Oh my god, I don't know where to start.
Pick a random one.
Okay, I'm going to try to go like sort of chronologically through what you said. So something that's really interesting to me about cyberpunk is it's very retro futurist at this point. Like it seemed kind of, I don't know, fresh and new when William Gibson started writing, when like Neuromancer came out and whatever. But if you look at the aesthetics of cyberpunk, there's like this fear and fascination with Japan. Japan is like the big other in this imagined world, and that comes out of World War II. That's like very it's a imagined future of the past. It's a different time. People had different concerns. There was this different sort of like xenophobic fear going on. And it's interesting to me to look at people who would call themselves futurists today. I think Elon Musk is a good example. I think he's more of a cyberpunk. There's a fascinating interview. This is a total tangent. There's a fascinating interview that Werner Herzog has in one of his films with Elon Musk. And Musk is saying, I think the world, essentially the gist of it is the world is going to go to shit. I'm building these rockets to Mars because I think like we're on a really bad track here. The world's going to a very dark place. I have nightmares at night. I can't think of how to make it better. So he has this very like fantastical idea of the future that's very disconnected from our present situation. It's very disconnected from what scientists are saying would actually lead to a safer, better, healthier future. It's the past haunting present conceptions of the future. I mean, the time is all out of joint.
Exactly.
Like
Exactly.
that's why I find hauntology and ghosts and hauntings and traces, whatever you want to call them, like such a powerful conceptual tool. It seems like a much more comprehensive way to think about our experience of time. We like to think of time as this simplified linear progression, but that's not how we experience it. I mean, you know, we have mental formations, we can have things like trauma or like anxiety. The way that we think about and feel and experience time is not linear, it's not chronological. It is being haunted by the past, being haunted by the future. um, I really like Mark Fisher's work in this area because he he does a lot of like cultural analysis, looking at films, looking at texts. And what's really important about that is he shows kind of like a cultural process that's happening alongside this more sort of political economic neoliberal process we were talking about. There's a cultural element to capitalist realism. It's in our literature, it's in our films. He talks a lot about the like repackaging of existing things, and like nothing truly new is being created. We're seeing repackaged forms of the 70s, 80s. We're seeing these trends just kind of repeat, like, okay, now it's time for bell bottoms, now it's time for skinny jeans again. Like we just keep going in this cycle
I've noticed this
of
in a lot of even like in podcasts. There is I've described like a good chunk of podcasts. I'm talking about Anglophone US centric podcasts that are essentially packaging millennial nostalgia. For lack of a better, it's often rewatching something that was like popular in the 90s or in the early 20s, and now you can rewatch it with your whatever favorite cast member and whatever, and it's episode by episode reliving those experiences or whatever it is. Or it's like there's I'm just gonna single it out just because I found it funny. I don't know anything about that podcast. It might be super good, I have no idea, but it was like what happened in 1992, and that was the name of the podcast. And it was like why musically that year was so like revolutionary or whatever it is. And I did not buy the premise. Like when I listened to the promo, it's like, no, this is actually just because there is enough content to talk about that specific year. But it's just very interesting that we're doing that. Again, I'm not saying no judgments if folks are really going through whatever, like that's a normal thing. But it's very interesting that yes, there is a sense that it's almost like we've exhausted creative ideas. We've exhausted the new, and now we're kind of repackaging, to simplify a bit, but like we're repackaging all of these things. Yeah, sorry.
no, that was great. um Yeah, I wrote a bunch of just like questions and thoughts on hauntology, like some things to ask you. I
Please.
don't know how much time we have left, but I'd love to
It
just get
doesn't
into it
matter.
some more.
Time does not, as we just
Okay.
said, time is not a thing. Yeah, go for it.
Great. Yeah. Um so just in like the reading I was doing on hauntology, it seems like an important tool for understanding this sort of like postmodern world we find ourselves in. I think maybe people have a lot of misconceptions about postmodernism and what it is. I see it, so I come from a literature background. I see it as mostly something descriptive. It's reading the world as a text, and it's sort of we've moved away from like a modernist vision of society or a positive vision for where we're going, what the world could be. It's like kind of this distrust of the future almost. We're averted of There's this aversion to telos, to teleology, to like our goals or where we're going. So you wind up in culture just seeing these kind of like repackaged forms that are all kind of um it's the same trend we see in technological innovation. David Graeber again has this really great essay. I think it's called on flying cars and the declining rate of profit or something like that. So he asked the question that you were asking just a moment ago, like, why don't we have flying cars? Why don't we have all these fantastic visions of the future? And a lot of it is because in technology, the innovations that we're getting aren't fundamentally new. They're just repackagings or combinations of existing forms. So there's this sense of like timelessness and just this extending present that never actually takes us into the future. So something else that comes up in conversations about temporality is this idea of like the long or protracted present. I was wondering how you see that in relation to I was wondering
Hauntology.
how you see that in relation to hauntology.
It's sort of it's like its cousin. I mean, it's both work at the same. So the protracted now is one of the terms I think a Lebanese theorist called Walid Ra'ad used, but it's very similar to like the ontological now, which I think Mark Fisher himself used. And the idea is just that the present is extended, like we are stuck in the present, and it's a very different type of being in the present, because you can think of, oh, I'm meditating and I'm being in the now. That's not what we're talking about. It's literally like you're in this because the past is sort of a blurry thing. I'm kind of using these metaphors. I'm trying to kind of use mnemonic aids for even listeners, if that helps. I mean, it helps me. But so that's what the past is. It's kind of it's a question mark in many ways, and the future is impossible. Like the future cannot be conceptualized. It's simply not something that can be conceptualized. And what ends up happening is that what we think of as the future ends up actually being a repackaging in many ways. And this is not to say, like, just to be very nuanced here or very clear, it's not to say that one cannot have original ideas or that innovations do not exist or whatever. That's not the point. The argument is more that even those original ideas, even those innovations, even this newness, this thing that is created or is taught, from scratch or whatever it may be, even all of that ends up actually having to conform in one way or another to a pre-existing pattern, or to, I don't know, something very simple is that you have an idea, a project idea or whatever it is, and you think, it can be revolutionary or whatever. And I'm not talking about startup. Even when we talk, I have to remember that there are these existing things that can come to people's minds. And so when I'm talking about it, like quite literally, you want to explore something. You want to discover something new, whatever it is. In order to do so, you need to think of how to get there, right? And so you need to think of the resources that you need. Maybe if you're already rich, I mean, you're lucky. If you're not, you need to find money somehow. So maybe you work for a few years, or maybe you find a loan from the bank, or whatever it is. And all of that already affects the project itself or the idea itself. It's not like, it's not that in Star Trek part of the easiness of that is that for the most part they can just explore something because whatever technological requirement is needed to do so has already been invented, like simplifying, but so they're able to have these what you might think of as thought experiments, but actually just have them on the screen and imagine them in that sense. So the protracted now is the inability to do that, is or at least is the resulting temporality from the inability to do that. And it's what we see today, but I think to some extent it's what we've seen for some time now. At the very least, like, it's very difficult to have a concrete timeline, and that will depend on where you live. And maybe this doesn't affect you and you don't live in it, and that's fantastic for you. But for most folks, I think these days, it's like roughly it started before me and you were born, I think, like 70s, 80s, and kind of peaked or has been peaking for some time now. Whether it collapses, whether it changes, I have no idea, obviously. And part of why I have no idea is that it's difficult to imagine the future. So we go back to the initial problem in many ways.
Yeah. So why is it so difficult? What's standing in the way? I wanted to do like a seance and bring these ghosts out. What ghosts are you seeing?
I think of very concrete things sometimes. Like I really think of what does it take, or why is it that I go to a family lunch, or I am sitting at a cafe and starting chatting with the old lady next to me. Whatever these situations may be, what stops me? And this is a me thing, but I'm just having a thought experiment here. What stops me from talking to that person or that relative or whatever it is about completely different worlds, right? Like what is this thing that prevents me? And I think it has to do with capitalist realism, in the sense that I actually feel in many ways that like I can be talking to that person, maybe that person says, well, actually that sounds like a nice idea, whatever it is, but then the link between, oh, this is a nice idea, it would be nice and whatnot, but oh, this can actually be done, we can actually do this today, that link is sort of severed. And the why, I mean, in many ways it's a consequence of learned helplessness, the fact that it is actually difficult to think of anything new anyway when you're used to something, like just again that mental process itself is not an easy thing to do, at least not, definitely not an easy thing for me to do. And that even when one imagines like all of those, let me put it this way, like I think if there is a lot of it, if there are a lot of solarpunk stories and it becomes normalized as an imaginary in the same way that cyberpunk is normalized and imaginary, I think the conversation would be very different. Let's put it that way. So maybe we're just chatting at sort of the beginning of something if we're hoping that this trend, and I have some, I think we can have some reason to believe that it will continue to kind of expand and expand and expand as an imaginary, largely because it's responding to an actual need. Like it's not just like we're just having fun for the sake of it, but we're actually, like, the thing that differentiates solarpunk especially from, I think, from a lot of other genre, if not most other genre, is that for the most part solarpunk tries to be practical, in the sense that even if you're imagining like, oh, this is what my city would look like in 2060 or whatever, and even if you're imagining some fantastical element to it, like you can communicate with elephants or whatever it is, like something that doesn't exist, let's say in our current reality, even if there is that element, you're doing so in the hope that it can, or at least a lot of the writers who write these stories are doing so in the hope that it can influence the reader's perception of our current reality. And that's very different from, I don't know, reading Lord of the Rings, which is a classical example I use because I was really into it growing up. I still kind of, Tolkien and all of that. It's a nice escapism, but I don't read those stories in the kind of with the assumption that, oh, how is this gonna better my life, right? Or how is this going to not just better my life, but how can we model our current society and change our current society based on the ideals of those societies in Middle Earth? I don't find them as ideals, right? I don't find them as better necessarily. Maybe they're nicer and more photogenic, but they're not necessarily, something to emulate in the present world, although aspects of them are nicer than our current world, which says more about our current world than about them, to be honest. But yeah, that's part of it anyway. One thing that we in our chat, like in our pre-recording thing, I think you wrote something, I wrote it here, like, getting through the depressing part is how we realize the positivity. And in many ways, like, it's sort of this thing of, again, using the mnemonic aid of like ghosts, in at least in like Christian mythology and whatnot, you can exorcise those ghosts. And again, I'm just using this as shorthands. Folks listening to this, you do not need to need that mnemonic aid necessarily. Think of whatever helps you, or something that may be more easier in your on your own cultural context or whatever it is. But if this helps you, then think of it this way, like, what can we do to exorcise those ghosts? Because part of in the mythology itself, like in the culture itself and whatnot, in that specific culture, is like you have to identify the ghost, maybe you have to name the ghost, and then maybe you have some counter spell or whatever it is to exercise that ghost, right? Like, but first it has to start with identifying it, right? Like you have to name it. Naming it is actually an important thing in that whole exorcism thing. Like if folks think of those movies like The Exorcist, if I remember well, like The Exorcist literally names the devil, right, in order to exorcise whatever. So that idea of being able to name it, I think, helps a lot. And I think being able to understand capitalist realism as like, yes, it's a realism, but realism doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean this is the realistic thing to do. In the same way that scientism is not scientific necessarily. Aspects of it might be, but in and of itself is a belief. And that belief has like assumptions, has a structure, has a logic, has whatever it may be. And they can be deconstructed, they can be taken apart, and we can replace them with things that we think are better. And that's the exercise. It's a very difficult one. Like, I get lost even thinking about it. But it's one that I think the more it is done and the more people do it, and the more it becomes easier to do it with the aid of cultural stuff, like, again, series, movies, books, whatever. in the same way, to not to repeat myself too much, but in the same way that it's super easy for us to imagine those apocalypse, zombies, whatever. Quite literally, I think I can say this with confidence. Like every single person listening to this has that in mind right now as I'm saying so, as I'm like talking about like those apocalypses, zombies, and whatnot. I want it to be as easy to do, if not easier, obviously, ideally, to imagine those other futures as being realistic. Like again, not just a utopia where I'm just escaping into Middle Earth and the Shire and I'm enjoying myself with some hobbits, but it's like literally I want this vision that I'm thinking about to feel like it's a realistic vision, because that's always been the power of cyberpunk, is that you're watching these futures and they kind of feel like they may happen. They're not nice, we don't want them to happen, but it sort of feels that we're going that way. You know, Elon Musk, as you mentioned, like that's basically, it's been internalized. And you know, obviously it's a scary thing that, you know, one of the richest men in the world thinks that way, but that is the case. That, and we know that this is actually Paul, like he's a very good example of this poverty of the imagination. Actually, we can make that argument. But yeah, walk us. I talk too much. Like walk us through this idea of like you know, something that's very depressing, like cyberpunk, which is obviously very depressing, but not just cyber. Like the stuff that we've been talking about, these ghosts. How can they lead us, so to speak, or how can studying them or whatever it is actually realize the positivity that we can explore better, if that makes sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this from personal experience. This kind of takes us back to the start of our conversation when we're talking about neoliberal philosophy. So that was the focus of my research for a while. Um, and something that you realize pretty early on when you start studying basically the philosophy that inspires the realism of the present. Maybe that's a good way to put it. Um, there there's a feeling in the world of ontology, of the things that exist, and some of those things might be like markets and participants in those markets, the self as an enterprise, personal branding, human capital. All of these things, these are objects that have been defined, that can be entered into like economic equations, that can be worked with. Um, and there's a sense that it's ontological, that's very foundational, just sort of like neutrally describing objects. But when you sort of break that apart and understand it as a hauntology, as you know, they're never fully present. It's always already absent present. That probably makes no sense, but
No, that does make sense.
I
I do
think
think the absent present is very, like, I think that's the ontological present, right? Like, that's the present that we think might exist or maybe should have existed by now, but doesn't. So,
it makes sense if you've read Dardot. Anyway, so I don't know how much explaining to do for the audience, but you know, the ghostliness of these presences, they're half presences. They're not really of our time. They're kind of the past, but also not really belonging to the past either. What's really cool about that is you can start to see through them. You can like pass your hand through it, realize that barrier isn't really as solid as you thought, and it's still there. You're still looking at it. It still shapes your thinking, but there is an outside to it. There's a constructedness of it. So my personal experience with coming to this research, I was so back in college, I was dealing with like a lot of mental health issues, feeling very depressed, sort of just I guess about myself, but also about the state of the world. I actually entered college to study ecology. So you know, I was really interested in ocean acidification, particularly, which is this horrible thing that's happening where little sea creatures can't make their shells anymore because the ocean got too acidic. Um, and that's a really there's a lot of tragedy and hopelessness and pessimism. I mean, it's all summed up in that term doomerism. I think that's kind of like the zeitgeist of our, I don't know about world or generation or culture, what would be the correct category there, but it's very present. Um, and I started the first book I read actually. sort of on this subject was capitalist realism, and I could not have chosen a better introduction because Mark Fisher also had personal struggles with mental illness, and in his work, including in capitalist realism, he talks about the personal aspects and the political aspects of depression and how maybe we need to stop personalizing these feelings so much, and actually there can be a lot of healing and recovery in understanding problems not as our own personal problems but as political ones, as constructed problems. And that was so important for me to hear, and it really set me on this track of, yeah, I guess, like, of seance, of recognizing these ghosts, of seeing how things that I felt were unchangeable, that were oppressing me, um, were actually a little a little less present, a little more absent than I thought. I can actually work to think outside of them. I don't know where I'm going with
No, I mean
this,
that
but
that that's already like honestly like I completely identify with that, and that's kind of the difference between when I've been doing therapy for some time now, but I found it most helpful when the therapist was able, and that was a previous therapist, was able to sort of help me frame some of my problems not just as a me thing, like not just as like my internal what happened when I was 9 or whatever, like, oh, it's something that you can pinpoint to your specific past, but maybe something that actually happened in your surroundings, maybe something that you've taken in, maybe whatever it may be. And I've understood better, I think, and by understanding it better, I've kind of regained a sense of my own agency in some sense. That the especially anxiety at the time, but also depression. Like I'm on antidepressant now as well. They are not just something that I have had to deal with because it's just what it is, right? Like there are like concrete reasons why this happened, and part of the reason why it's so difficult to overcome it or to move beyond it, or whatever term we want to use here, why isn't there more of an emphasis as well, like just to kind of stay on this specific topic, on like what can be done as a group or a community or as a society or as a nation, or or however one wants to scale it up. But why aren't there more things that are done, let's say, on that side, to make this less of a recurring phenomena, right? And a good chunk of that reason, if not the main reason, I think Fisher argues that way, and I think we both agree on that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that we live in an economic system, in a framework, in a zeitgeist, and whatever one term, paradigm, whatever, where this is simply not the priority. Where even tackling anxiety and depression or whatever is basically only good insofar as it makes you a more productive subject, right? As it makes you like, oh, that's not good to be depressed and whatnot because you're not working well, you're not earning a good enough salary, and whatever the logic in that specific, there are different examples there, but the underlying logic is essentially, I think, is essentially that ultimately the good isn't the thing. The good thing that can come out of this therapy session, whether it's group or individual, or this, I don't know, medication in some cases, whatever the specifics might be. The point of the of getting better should be that you're getting better because this is good for you, because it's good to be better, to heal. Let's put it that. I don't want to use a productivist language, but like to heal from something, right? Like to go through a process of healing and so on. It's not as efficient in the current world we live in, not because of like that individual therapist necessarily, although there are some shitty therapists, obviously, lots of them. It's not just like, oh, what, it's not just the specifics. Like, I'm trying to be as broad as I can here. It's not those specific individuals who live in that. It's that usually the framework that is used is by default limiting or limited, because you can't question, like, I can't usually, if I go to the therapist, and this has happened, right, to give a very concrete example, and I say like, yeah, I'm anxious and I'm depressed because I'm a migrant in Switzerland, and because that wasn't easy, especially back when I started, and because I come from a context in Lebanon where like I've seen shit, and I've lived through like difficult things or whatever it may be. And usually, like, it's not like, okay, let's talk about that or what have you. Although there are some therapists who would say that. It's like, okay, but let's discuss how this has affected you, and what can you do about it to not let it affect you. Now, that's important. I'm not saying that's not important. or not let it destroy you. Let's put it that way. That's an important skill or whatever, but it's limited because it cannot in the tools themselves doesn't tackle the thing that caused the trauma in the first place, right? Like because it's not a society-wide framework. It's an individualistic framework. So ideally, you have all of them at the same time, obviously. Although I think arguably if you have all of them at the same time, at some point the individualized method would not be as needed in the same way, if that makes sense. But that's sort of how I think I've been thinking about it. And that's why like therapy for me has been important. But I'm getting to a point where I feel like I need something that's not just that, or at the very least something that goes beyond that. That's just me though.
Right. No, that's a great point. It's a very nuanced point, but that nuance is really important. It's not the problem is not therapy or medication or this like healing process. The problem is how it's implemented. That's why I think psychopolitics is a really critical concept to understand. These technologies, I think of them as technologies, psychotherapy as a technology, become technologies of power. So a good example would be like a human resources department at a company. You can go in and you can talk to someone about the problems you're experiencing, but the department is not there to make you healthy. I mean, they kind of are.
It's not that to
They're
fix the
not
company,
there.
right?
Yeah, they're not there for your benefit. They're there to protect the company's bottom line, and they it is this is oversimplifying, but I mean, it is cheaper to like erase any opposition you're having on an individual level rather than restructuring the company. And that's a great role for therapy, for psychology within this very like privatized neoliberal system, um, is to solve problems on the most individualized, personalized scale possible rather than restructuring society in a way where, we're not all constantly surveilling ourselves and disciplining ourselves. Like, that leads to a hell of a lot of anxiety. And if we could not feel so much pressure to be productive and to, like, heal ourselves so that we can be more productive, like, if there isn't that constant demand on our psyches, I think we'd be a lot happier. But that also requires a bigger structural shift. I had another.
But you feel like you see that
Oh,
all of even this conversation in many ways is sort of like haunted by those ideas and those concepts, and then that's why I find it a very useful thing, to be honest. Like it just again as a mnemonic device, it's kind of easier to think of something that is otherwise very abstract if you're able to not necessarily personify it, but like to think of it as something concrete in one way or another. Just as something that's like it's next to you. It's not necessarily you, but it's affecting you in that sense. That's why like ghost is such an, and I think most people can imagine ghosts. So that makes it useful as well.
totally. Yeah. Yeah. The last thing I wanted to mention on that is the concept of responsibilization. I think one of my book recommendations is going to be a book about this. Another critical component of neoliberal ideology is personal responsibility. And there's this idea that we are, as the self as enterprise, we are responsible for our productivity and our happiness and our health, and these concepts all just kind of blend into each other. So you wind up with like on a very fundamental physical level, there are policies in place, like in the UK, this like return this what's it called, i I don't remember what it's called, but the idea is that the goal of therapy is for you to return to work. So you're provided with these resources as long as you're looking for jobs, and as long as the goal of your healing is to become a productive citizen again. It's like all kind of collapsed into this incentive structure, and that influences like literal policies and the landscape of society and how you navigate it. You have to interact with these things. So it totally makes sense that you're going to internalize them and think that it is your responsibility and it is your fault that you're not happy, when really it could be something as concrete as, your health benefits were just taken away because of a policy. That's not your fault, but it can feel like it
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
is.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's why, like, to find a way to synthesize everything we've just said, which is not gonna work. So I'm gonna fail, and I'm just gonna fail. But being able to, and also because just to slowly wrap up, because we've been talking for about an hour and a half, um, and there should be an upper limit on podcasts, I have learned. But and yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna do other episodes eventually anyway. But for now, the synthesis in some sense is that, okay, there are these ghosts, and they can be identified. Like, there are actual conceptual tools that are actually, they sound fancy and difficult, and maybe at first they may sound intimidating, but I generally think that they are relatively approachable in the sense that you can, by using these mnemonics, shortcuts, maybe we can think of, like, quite literally imagine ghosts and understand why are these ghosts still present around us, and more kind of deeply, maybe, if that's the correct term, why are we still sort of stuck in thinking about, in not being able to think, because we're stuck, about futures that on some level we know, or imaginaries, alternative imaginaries that we kind of know, on even like on an, I don't know, emotional level maybe, or like on some deep level or whatever, that they shouldn't be that difficult. Like, what is, when there's this thing that happens on a scaling, like when we scale things up, right? Like when I think of mutual aid and I talk about mutual aid, most folks, even most folks I think listening to this, can picture this working with like very close friends, maybe some relatives. Like, sure, of course, I'm not gonna, make my sister pay if she needs something. Maybe I'm just gonna help her out or whatever it may be. It's kind of an instinctual thing almost, like, okay, because it's within the paradigm in which we exist, mutual aid is acceptable if it is within certain structures, right? So within certain frameworks, usually the family, but maybe like, oh, your best friend, you treat that best friend like your sister or your sibling or your brother or whatever it may be, that sort of thing. It's like, oh, that's normal, that's a good healthy way of friendship. But like, we kind of imagine that, like, well, the nature of that friendship is that you can be there for one another, you can complement each other's needs. Maybe you have something to help that you can offer, and maybe that person can offer. There can be some kind of exchange, mutual aid, whatever it may be, or doing something without necessarily the expectation that they have to do something in return, that sort of thing. But when we scale it up, then it becomes a matter of, like, that's just not realistic. Right? Like, that's not, there are too many things. And typically, scaling anything is always by definition more complicated. But complicated does not mean not feasible, and it doesn't mean not realistic. Like, those are three very different things that we tend to actually mix up quite a lot, I think, in like day-to-day discourse. Something can be super complicated but is actually very feasible and might be better than something that feels simpler but is not very good. Like, it's much simpler to imagine a world where it's like a dog eat dog, again, this whole nasty Buddhist short thing belief where it's all homo economicus. That's very easy to actually imagine it, but clearly that's not a good thing that's happening. So we can imagine something that's more complicated but can actually be more realistic, more feasible, more, what have you. So that's what I would kind of, these are my final thoughts or whatever, and I'll leave it up to you to sort of also like give us like some of your like kind of final reflections, at least for the purpose of this episode, like this conversation, and then continue on with like your recommendations on like the three books, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great summary. I think you're right. You're spot on with like, just because something is complicated doesn't mean it's not realistic. I just wanted to say, like, studying the intellectual history of neoliberalism, you realize that this was a very complicated project. It is still complicated to try to maintain it. There are just so many people working on it who are involved in theorizing and policymaking. This, it might feel like it might feel like we have simple explanations on an everyday level, but those are really just like tiny pieces of neoliberal philosophy that we've internalized. It is not a whole comprehensive picture. It is a very complicated one, a very complicated history, and a very concerted effort on the part of philosophers and politicians and business people to implement it. And if they can do it, we could do something else. Everything takes hard work.
They already imagined a future that they wanted, or whatever metaphor we want to use, and it sort of happened. And obviously, it didn't happen perfectly, as much as like it didn't happen in the exact same way that they imagined it, but like close enough. And so there's no reason why we can't do that as well.
I find it weirdly inspiring in a twisted way. Like they did establish a new way of doing things when we needed a new way of doing things. It's just there are some very major problems with it. It's time to make another one, but these things are possible. They happen. People change the world all the time. There this sense of realism, capitalist realism, that nothing is changing. Total illusion. The world is changing all of the time. So I guess that's where I would end. Things are going to change no matter what, and it's up to us to direct those changes, to come up with ideas, to organize, to make the changes we want to see.
Like to quote, I think Octavia Butler in the parable of the sower, like the only constant is change. Like God is change, as she would put it in that book. But like the only constant is change. The difference, and that's like one of the mottos of degrowth, is like it's either degrowth by design or degrowth by disaster. Like change by design or change by disaster. Like as in change is inevitable. Like that's just how the world. That's just how reality is. But we need to make the argument that we can have agency over that change in order to redirect it in a way that we feel is beneficial for like most humans, or like for all humans and non-humans as well, for that matter.
Absolutely. That's a perfect quote to end on. So I'll just give my book recommendations. Yeah. I've been trying, like, thinking throughout this conversation, narrowing it down to 3. I mean, definitely top of the list would be Byung-Chul Han's Psychopolitics. That it's just like it's a tiny little book. You can read it in an afternoon, but it's given me so many ideas. It was kind of like the starting point for this research project. And then one I don't hear people talk about a lot, but I think is really, really great. So this is Melinda Cooper's Family Values. And that's a really interesting investigation into how neoliberalism has become aligned with neoconservative values. Because if you think about it on the face of it, it seems like they'd be kind of contradictory, at least based on most leftist analysis of liberalism. It seems like they would be contradictory, but they do have this really interesting synergy. And she goes through all of the policies, mostly focusing on the history of the US and policies after the New Deal. Just great book. Really can't recommend it enough. And then I guess my last recommendation, for just kind of a general overview of, I guess, a neoliberal ontology, which should maybe be understood as a hauntology. Pierre, Dardot, and Christian Laval, The New Way of the World on Neoliberal Society. And that one, much larger volume, but that sort of touches on psychopolitics a little bit, but then goes into more of a Foucault, biopolitics and enterprise self-analysis. And they go really in depth into that enterprise model, how it looks, how it manifests. And that's just kind of a great, like, catch-all starting point for where you want to go.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I think it says already a lot that we said, well, we'll keep it to around an hour, and it's been an hour and 44 minutes. But I mean, it just shows that there's just a lot to talk about, and I really hope, and I think like we can just do more of them. Like eventually, we can just plan more episodes and whatnot. Your podcast is Solarpunk now. I obviously recommend folks listening to it. This episode would also be there as sort of like a collab thing. Yeah, Luka, thanks a lot for this. This was like lots of fun. Gave me a lot to think about, and as I said, I'm sure we'll do it soon-ish again, another one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.